The next speaker is from Mexico. This is Gabriel. So thank you again, Thomas. Gabriel, thank you for joining us today. Gabriel Baltazar Pedraza is an international lawyer. You are an attorney specialized in constitutional law. Gabriel, you are also the founder and the president of Generation for Democracy, which is an international organization, and you are a partner at Abogados and Defensa Fiscal. So, Gabriel, due to your expertise in constitutional law, my first question among 4 questions is the following. Is fake news in Mexico, but maybe generally speaking, constitutionally protected?
I am very honored to be here, sharing what I know. Regarding your question, well, it obviously depends on the constitutional system of each national jurisdiction. But I will talk about the American and the Mexican jurisprudence, which is what I'm familiar with. And well, according to both jurisprudence, which are very similar in this particular matter, fake news generally does have constitutional protection. Well, this was stated in the plurality decision in United States versus Alvarez, where the court, in general terms, said that false statements are generally qualified for constitutional protection. So what the court did in Alvarez is it invalidated the Stolen Valor Act, which is an statute that punished false claims regarding military decorations and medals. So what happened here is that a person said publicly that he had received the Medal of Honor, which is the highest ranking honor that the United States government gives to military people that serve in the military. So what the court said is that this law, although the government has a compelling interest in protecting military honors, the punishment or the terms of the law was not necessary because there are other means which are less restrictive in terms of freedom of speech, which can also achieve the government interest. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, said that the only effective way to persuade people that false statements are actually false is with counter speech. So the rationale behind Alvarez is basically the market of ideas theory. The market of ideas theory was introduced to American jurisprudence by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in a very famous dissent on Abrahams versus United States, where he said, and I'm quoting, "The ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition market." So the market of ideas theory was is based on the notions of a very famous philosopher, John Stuart Mill. So in his very famous book as well on liberty, he argued that the false speech should be protected because truth only can be achieved when it is confronted against false statements. So only when there is collision with errors, we can know what statements are true. So these are the philosophical and judicial foundations of why some or most fake news are constitutionally protected.
Thank you, Gabriel. My second question is, does fake news really allow the marketplace of ideas to function properly?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Not really. For instance, according to Danielle Emanci, fake news, especially fake news on social media, can disrupt the marketplace of ideas in multiple ways. The first one is that fake news are very easy to upload and distribute, and they can be disguised as legitimate source of information. So this can produce confusion and deceit on a massive scale. Also, because this is the stories that have more shock value are the ones that become more popular. Conspiracy theories are getting more traction. And this also produces a very particular problem, which is called parasitic journalism, which it is only the reproduction of information produced by another source, right? So what happens is that this draws away viewership and funds from professional media. So journalistic investigation is not founded because there is no revenue. And this also produces that people distrust the traditional and professional media, the professionals in the media, right? Another problem that surfaces with fake news is what some of the persons that talked before me refer as catering news, right? So catering news is that social media platforms only show information that we already agree with. So this creates a sort of a veil that doesn't allow us to confront the ideas that we already have with other ideas. So we live in a sort of a information bubble, right? So what happens is that all these distortions produced by fake news in the market of ideas harm the press role as a counterpower of the government. So the press is not allowed to properly function as the watchdog of the government. And this is very visible in the way that politicians are communicating directly with people through social media, and there is not the traditional filter of mainstream media that can analyze if what politicians are saying is actually true or false.
Gracias, Gabriel. My third question is, how does social media contribute to the propagation of fake news?
Well, according to some authors, there are three main reasons why social media especially contributes to the dissemination of fake news. The first one is that lying on social media is easier than lying on real life. What happens is that on social media, people can portray personas that they don't necessarily will portray in real life. And this is because mainly of anonymity, and also because people can use other names. So what happens is that people are actually insulated from the responsibility or the consequences of their comments. The classic example of this is trolls. So trolls are usually anonymous. Nobody knows who the troll is, and they can often publish and disseminate fake news without assuming any sort of personal responsibility. The second reason that some authors identified is that social media allows immediate provision of news by ordinary people. So what happens is that people have the thrill to be the first to share some news, right? So what happens is that people do not think, do not fact check if the news that they are about to share is actually real, because everything happens so fast. what happens is that social media, it's really obsessed with the speed of the content and not so much about the quality of the content. For instance, a few days ago, a good friend of mine, a good lawyer, a very well-educated people, who opposes very strongly against the Mexican president, he shared a news about the son of the president being on vacations in the beaches of Bolivia, right? So what happened is that Bolivia doesn't have any beaches. So it was only because he wanted to be the first one to share with the world this type of news, because he strongly opposes the president, that he was disseminating this obviously false information. So he didn't think it twice. There is another problem, another distortion of the market, and it is the huge reach of every post that it's propagated within social media. So what happens is that people get infected. So this can be a good analogy with what's happening at the moment, with the bogus of an inaccurate media report. So when they share that information, they are infecting another person as well, or multiple persons as well. So the World Health Organization recently declared an infodemic during the pandemic. And this is precisely what they have in mind. People just sharing information across the globe, which is fake, and people just repeating it. So especially during times of crisis, like the one we're experiencing during this COVID crisis, people are more vulnerable to fake news. Why? Because people are afraid, because people are desperate. So what happens is that within this social circumstances, people tend to share social media posts without fact-checking, just because they have to act fast and they are afraid of what they don't actually understand or what they don't know. So I don't want to talk about abundantly about these examples, because they were already mentioned by Mrs. Hashmi. But for instance, Trump claimed that hydroxychloroquine was an effective remedy for coronavirus. And he also said that drinking chlorine or disinfectant was another way to treat it. So people who are actually desperate because they're ill or because they are afraid of the virus can follow Trump's or Mr. Trump's advice. And another good example is what happened in Iran. So there was another conspiracy theory about drinking alcohol as a way to cure COVID-19. So a lot of people died, a lot of people went blind because they were drinking alcohol as a way to treat it. And obviously, probably the most insane example is what happened in the UK especially, which was also mentioned before, where people were actually attacking infrastructure, 5G infrastructure, and engineers, because they were claiming, or there was a very popular conspiracy theory about 5G being responsible for the COVID-19 crisis, which is obviously absurd. But if people are afraid and people are desperate, they are going to blame somebody.
Thank you, Gabriel. We have been talking a lot about it for the last 2-3 years. We all believe that our generations are facing new challenge related to infinite small, infinite large. We already discussed it with Judge Renata, which is very interesting for us as lawyers. How and should we regulate artificial intelligence, blockchain? What about space? We cannot touch it, we cannot see it. This is global, we cannot see the borders. So it's a new challenge for us, because of course you have tax expectations, etc. So these questions have already been mentioned during this virtual conference, but I would like to have your opinion, and this is my last question, Gabriel. Can fake news be regulated? And if so, how? Thank you.
Thank you, Aubin. That's a very interesting question. In my opinion, yes, they can be regulated. Although fake news generally are constitutionally protected, this doesn't mean that the government cannot regulate them. According to Alvarez, the judicial precedent that I mentioned before, the regulation of fake news or false statements, in order to be constitutionally valid, should survive strict scrutiny. What does strict scrutiny means? It means that the law or the measure that the government uses to regulate fake news should further or advance a compelling government interest, and the measure should be narrowly tailored to achieve that objective. So what ways can the government regulate fake news? Well, the most obvious one is laws that punish the publication and dissemination of fake news. So there are multiple complications with this type of law, which in my opinion, they are usually unconstitutional because they infringe on the freedom of speech. But one of the main complications is that this type of law needs or usually requires intent, both in knowing that the fake news you are about to share is false, and also knowing that it is very likely that a public harm will be produced. So in order to prosecute this type of crimes, it becomes almost impossible to demonstrate intent, right? So even from the practical prosecution side, this type of laws are not usually very effective. But also, according to Alvarez, it is very possible that this type of legislation is invalidated because it is not necessary in the same sense that I mentioned before, which is that the government can regulate fake news by counter speech, right? So whenever there is a less restrictive alternative to regulate fake news, the more restrictive alternative most likely will be invalidated. And also, this type of law that punishes the publication of dissemination of fake news has a very detrimental effect for freedom of speech, which is what constitutional experts called chilling effects. So what happens is that if you have the need or the intention to share or publish some information which you are not completely sure is true, you will not do it because the fear of prosecution. So this is another argument why this type of legislation will most likely be invalidated because it infringes freedom of speech. And also because there are so many people and platforms sharing fake news, for the government, it will be impossible to prosecute all cases. So what might happen in reality is that the government only persecutes and prosecutes people that expresses ideas that are critical of the government. So, I mean, there are multiple arguments why, or reasons why this type of legislation is not, in my opinion, a good remedy to regulate fake news. Another alternative is counter speech. So according to some authors, counter speech, social media has a way of correcting itself. And what they claim is that in the same way that social media can reproduce very fastly information which is false, it is also very easy to verify if the information is true or not. What they claim is that the cost of fact-checking is so low that the social media self-correction mechanism works well. Another type of counter-speech is governmental counter-speech. And this can take many forms. For instance, it can be about publication of official data and information, which people can verify against fake news. But also, it can be what we have been seeing in governments all around the world, which is government officials controlling and disseminating the information, the official information about the COVID crisis. So, but in my opinion, again, counter-speech is not a good remedy for fake news. Why? Because it doesn't solve the distortions of the marketplace of ideas that we were mentioning, that I was mentioning before. Because there's so much flooding of fake news, and people are they distrust the government and official media news information. It is almost impossible to change people's mind. A third alternative that the government has to regulate fake news is with education. Obviously, education can be the less restrictive measure to regulate fake news. So what has been proposed is that educational systems focus on fact-checking. So it is, the main idea is to incentivize a culture of skepticism with online news and also critical analysis. For instance, in Finland, primary and secondary schools have specific courses about information literacy and also critical thinking. In my opinion, this could be a long-term solution for the problem, but in the short term, it will not function, right? So a fourth alternative, which I found very interesting, is the licensing of professional journalists. So this proposition is based on three main rules. The first one is that there should be an ethic code of how the professionals of journalism should act. So this way, people can trust again in official media, and also official media or the press can actually function as the watchdog of the government. A second principle about the licensing of professional journalists is that they should be required to continue their education throughout their careers. So this will allow journalists to know how to use technology and also how to avoid the dissemination of fake news. And finally, this type of regulation would not mean that people can, that non-journalists can share and publish information on their own. But so in this way, people are allowed to express their opinion, but there is also a qualified source of information that people can actually trust. And in my opinion, it's a good way of balancing public, freedom of speech, and also finding some mechanism that can regulate fake news. Because non-journalists can still talk, and when journalists doesn't comply with the rules I just mentioned, they should lose their license. But they can still talk freely. They won't just be a journalist. And this sort of licensing exists in every country for many professions like ours. So in my opinion, it could be a good alternative.
Thank you, Gabriel. I was glad to listen to you, and I was also educated in this time where when I was in the high school, a professor always told me that if I have knowledge, I will be able to select my information and to have my own opinion. So I was glad also to listen it today. I believe we are still sharing this hope about knowledge, but we also do understand that technology, ethic, rules could help us. Once again, Gabriel, thank you for joining us.